Um, thank you. Keen sense of timing. Thank you. Very exciting to see all you guys in place. Hi, much for coming. My name is Mark Krotov. I'm the publisher of N+1 and currently one of the editors. I will try to stay out of the way of these amazing and brilliant panelists as much as possible. But, you know, as always, one really only has one goal, and that's for everybody on this attendee list to subscribe to N+1 magazine if they don't already. If you do subscribe already, it's a great time to tell your friends to subscribe. Tell those friends to subscribe. This is an event about organizing, but you know, organizing in the name of N+1 subscriptions is not an ignoble goal. And I'd like to encourage you to leave this event with that spirit. N+1mag.com/subscribe is where you can do that. And I'll probably remind you of that dozens more times throughout this evening, perhaps at inopportune moments. But onto the event itself. This is really, gosh, this is an all-star cast. And it's really, really exciting to spend the evening with them and not with Twitter and Twitter discussing the RNC. Let's just leave it at that. This is really, it's really, this is a source of liberation. I'll introduce these panelists quickly, and then I will, you know, maybe we'll start off discussing the essay in the current issue. That's kind of the reason that we've gathered here, and then we will we'll go from there. Our panelists this evening are R.E.M. Brostoff. They are the culture editor at Jewish Currents and an editor at N+1. They wrote about Vivian Gornick and her book, The Romance of American Communism, for the current issue of N+1, issue 37. Alyssa Battistoni, who is a postdoc at the Harvard University Center for the Environment and an editor at Jacobin, and the author of another remarkable piece about organizing in N+1 called Spadework. Nikil Saval, who's the former co-editor of N+1 and now the Democratic candidate for state senate in the state of Pennsylvania. And Mlotek, who is a freelance writer, editor, and organizer. Thank you all so much for being here. I want to start with Ari because yeah, their piece, The Family Romance of American Communism has sort of occasioned us to be here, and you know, and it's a piece that of course means a lot to me as a reader. It also means a lot to me as its editor. It's a piece that whose time span and duration really is probably, you know, it's coterminous with, you know, perhaps a series of presidential administrations, but certainly with you know, with the past couple years. And I'd like Ari, I'd like for you to sort of discuss the genesis of the piece, but also, you know, maybe with like a particular attention to how the piece took shape in response, particularly to sort of the political events of, I would say, the first few months of this year, because I feel like a lot of what you and I talked about in the editing process was just like, oh my God, this happened. So how do we deal with that? Thank you.
Okay. Hi, thanks everybody. I'm very excited and somewhat anxious about being here. I guess maybe I can actually start by explaining my slight anxiety as a way to talk about the piece, which is to say, this piece would not have occasioned a panel about organizing if the piece had, well, if I had finished it either, you know, the first time I was trying to finish it on a deadline when it was supposed to be a dissertation chapter that I was working on in like 2015, 2016, or if I had just finished it like end of last year or like, you know, even very beginning of this year in its sort of second life as an N+1 piece. And because neither of those things happened, it wound up becoming very different than it was, and wound up being much more about organizing because, which is very much what Gornick's book, The Romance of American Communism, is about. But for me, organizing became a thing that I would say I kind of like did for real, only starting in the past few months. And so there's been this very funny kind of like chiasmatic, I don't know if that's the word, relationship between like the piece and that experience. So I mean, basically the piece started as a dissertation chapter about, I was trying to understand why it was that in the 1970s there was this wave of work about communist families and red diaper babies, which is kind of the the like in-group term for the in-group term if you're in the in-group, and if you're on the right, it's like a slur. But the term for kids who grow up in communist families and communist communities. And in the 60s, this is like, a sort of complicated and contested history, but like the kind of like very broad strokes way that the history usually gets told is that in the 60s, there's this real kind of schism that opens up between the old left in the US of the Communist Party and the new left that's associated with the campus movements, the civil rights movement, and Black Power and feminism and so on and so forth. And regardless of kind of what the relationship between old and new left actually is, one thing that seemed pretty clear to me as a grad student was that in the 70s, people were suddenly interested, like writers and artists on the left were suddenly interested in a way that they definitely had not been for, a decade or so before, in kind of the like domestic, mundane kind of like family life of the old left. And it felt like there were really interesting kind of narrational tensions getting worked out and political tensions getting worked out. And I was really interested in this Il Doctorow novel, The Book of Daniel, which is about kind of a fictionalized version of the Rosenberg family. I was writing about that, and the Gornick book, and some Adrienne Rich poems, and like a few other objects. I mean, it was also like a very kind of Jewish archive, but I like did not know how to deal with that at all, because that was like when I was like not writing about Jewish things. So, that was like sort of, there were like many reasons why the did, but basically, yeah, I was trying to figure out like why was there this resurgence of interest? And I thought that there was that because in the 70s there was this real sense of burnout and like despondency on the left, that people were interested in looking back at the at the experience of the Communist Party as like ongoing movement, because they wanted to know kind of what it would look like to like buckle down for the long haul. And they were, I think, interested in thinking about, feelings like bitterness. But also in things like, how do you like socially reproduce the left? Like what could that even mean? And so I was initially thinking about Gornick, as a kind of part of like a cluster of these objects and ideas, and thinking about, left melancholy a lot, this kind of concept that gets batted around a lot. And then, it was too sad. like I mean, I kind of say this in the ultimate, the piece that, you know, ultimately came to be, but yeah, I was, this was early 2016, and I was really, really depressed. And we can get into that later if it becomes relevant. But I couldn't finish it. Like, the content was so, I felt so deeply like melancholic about it, that I just like, I got like very blocked. And it was only a few years later that I felt like I was able to really go back to it. And then Mark and I, you know, worked on it together for a very long time. And you know, and and the second time around doing it was like really a pleasure. And then it got kind of crazy at the end because I don't know, I think I had like 3,000 words, and Mark was like, this should be 6,000 words. And I was like, oh my God. And then like COVID happened, and like the world, I mean, I think I got the final draft in like right before the uprising started, and was like, oh my God. I mean, this is like the most shallow thing ever to say, but like, seriously, like it never would have been finished if that had like happened 1 week earlier, because I would have had to figure out what the fuck to like, you know, it was just, I don't know. I'm sure this is like a lot of people's experience writing anything kind of long form this year, is just like your frame changes every other week. And so the frame kind of kept changing, like the you know, the sort of moment of like jubilation at the beginning of the year of like, holy shit, like, is Bernie actually gonna pull this off? And then the collapse of that, and COVID, and like, I mean, it basically, like, that last like 3,000 words or whatever, a lot of it wound up being this almost like, I don't know, it's like if it was in the New Yorker, it would be like a COVID diary or whatever. Like, I really was just trying to like get down from week to week, like what I was seeing or doing, and trying to put that into the context of this piece, just to like make some sense of the whole thing. And yeah, I don't know. I will stop there, and would love to hear from everybody else.
Yeah, that's really some of those details of the editing process are really not how I remember them, but we'll discuss that off.
Okay.
Yeah, there's so many questions I want to ask all of you, but I'm curious because Alyssa, you also wrote a really marvelous piece for Dissent about the Vivian Gornick book, which I should say, part of the occasion for writing about this book is that it was reissued by Verso earlier this year. Should pick up a copy. But of course, like, and your pieces are very different, but they're, Alyssa, at one point you sort of, you tie this, the book itself is, I think, part of what makes it so interesting and so complicated is that it has this like ultimate ambivalence about communism, about organizing, about romance, even as it's kind of day-to-day, like its page-to-page is full of fervor, right? So if you only read the first third, it's actually maybe like one of the most inspiring books ever. And you're like, I have to go to the fashion district and go up the steps and find this communist meeting, and this is my time, and then you keep reading. But I was struck by this kind of the turn in your piece where you write, you say, whether or not Gornick's communists are sympathetic, I think she does describe something essential about political commitment. So if she's right about where it inevitably leads, we should be worried. To knock on doors for hours in the freezing cold, you need to believe you're taking a step toward Medicare for all, even if you know how distant a possibility it is. In turn, because it is so distant, the work of taking that small step also has to be meaningful in itself. And, as someone who is an organizer and who's written so beautifully and also kind of full of similar turmoil and contradiction about organizing for N+1, I was just curious about how you sort of like what your relationship with the book was in light of that sort of real fundamental, ambivalence.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that I think really changed a lot over the course of the first and second times I read it. So I read it the first time, actually, I had been organizing for the Yale Grad Student Union for many years, and people kept telling me about this book. They're like, oh, you have to read The Romance of American Communism. And so I bought the like old like silver copy with like a giant Vivian Gordon face on the back. But it's, so I got that like on, you know, like Amazon used books or whatever. But of course I didn't have time to read it until after I stopped organizing and after we had kind of had this, you know, major setback in the organizing campaign, because like when you're organizing, you don't have time to read or write very much about organizing, which maybe we can talk about later, of like the kind of challenges of like portraying and writing about and like talking about organizing in ways that are or I was thinking about this in like the moments when organizing about writing like emerges, or probably like after the pinnacle of some moment or of activity or campaign or something. But anyway, so I read it then and I was like, oh my God, finally, like a book that understands what it was like, because it is so full of, I think I was really looking for something that would describe like not just organizing strategy or like, I don't know, there were like a lot of pieces, and there are a lot of pieces about like how to organize in a kind of almost technical sense, or like what to do, like here are the steps, or like how some of the strategic considerations on like where the left should be organizing or focusing or whatever. But I don't know, I was really desperate for something that would speak to like what this really intense and all-consuming experience I had been through for like several years that ended up being like my entire life by the end, had been like, and how that had happened and what it had felt like. And I felt like romance really did that. And so I was like, wow, this book is so amazing. I get why everyone told me to read it. I like underlined the whole thing, whatever. And then when I went back and reread it to when Verso reissued it to write this piece for Dissent, I was like, it was very interesting to me, like how differently I read it and how much more like kind of disturbed I was by like my earlier total identification with it, and what that made me think about, like, well, what am I, you know, both like how should we read this identification, because I don't think Gornick is like embracing this approach, or like the romance, she's very skeptical of it. She thinks it's, you know, there's something deeply tragic in her portrayal of the romance of American communism, and I think in general in her portrayal of politics, that like that there is this like tragedy at the heart of it, that is noble but kind of doomed. And so I was really resistant to that. And I think I was, you know, some the first time around, but that was struck me much more so on the second time around. Because I was like, I don't want to kind of say, well, you know, it's like really a beautiful struggle and like it's too beautiful to live or whatever, and we're all just going to be like sigh over that. I mean, that's to be a little glib about it. Like there's a lot in the book, and it still does really describe a lot of experiential things. Kind of like the phenomenology of organizing or something, in some really like intense way. But I think the frame around it was something that I wanted to think more about, or like how do we read and interpret this like experiential account and these moments of recognition. What does that mean? Like, what does it like? What do we do with that kind of you know, the sort of like intensity of feeling she describes, and the ways to channel it, and I think one of the big questions I have is often like, how can you both recognize, and that go to the sort of like passage that you read, Mark, is like, how can you like hold this bigger vision and project and like vision and ambition in these moments of doing really mundane things, and like and so much of, I think what's beautiful about romance is how it does sort of show how that the vision of like a political project can like suffuse these really boring and mundane moments when you're just doing like the shit work, but at the same time like keep some perspective, so you're not just like anything for the cause and like you're doing things that aren't actually advancing your goals. Like, because I think the thing about organizing is being very like trying to balance those things and trying to really like be pragmatic and transformative at the same time, and that's very hard to do. And I think sometimes like yeah, you have to have the carry the vision and some mundanity, but without just saying anything that you do is like a step towards something that it may not actually be, and how can we keep that perspective? So yeah, that's I can stop there and hear what Haley and Nikil think about organizing, Gornick, whatever, but much more to say about all of this and about art suits, which I have many thoughts on also. Yeah, I guess like the one other thing I'll say that I think is really like that, well, actually I'll say it later.
Well, I definitely obviously want to talk about, sort of the pragmatic and the transformative are kind of useful. It's a useful dichotomy, and in Nikil, we have someone who has, successfully mastered both. So, and I do want to hear about that, but and I hope this isn't sort of like too far in the opposite direction, but Haley, I'm curious, just as someone who writes, who does organizing work and of course is just writing all the time and is also editing a lot and sort of editing conscientiously and with a degree of sort of selectivity about the work that you yourself are that you're putting yourself into. I'm curious how you're feeling, I guess, at this moment about like, and forgive me if this is too sort of I don't know, but the aesthetics of organizing, I guess, and like how editorially, what is your relationship to that? Because of course we know in Nikil's case, he wrote about organizing and he organized and edited some pieces about organizing, and then of course the straight line between that and becoming, a politician is very clear. But for those of us who aren't necessarily on that path, I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, for sure. For a second, I really didn't know what the end of that question was going to be, and I got nervous. But aesthetics, for sure, we can absolutely talk about the aesthetics. And yeah, I was especially taken with what Alyssa said about how when you're in the moment of organizing, there's really not a lot of time for reading about it or writing about it. And I think that is true, because my earlier organizing experience had this very concrete beginning, middle, and end. I sort of got like a little bit of a break where I was able to also sort of turn to the references that kept coming up, or the other books and articles that people were saying. And I just found like every time I found an essay like Spadework or like Ari's essay about the family romance, I've just been so grateful to have other people who are doing a similar type of work put it into their words. And like, that's the part of the work that I do love every time it happens. I'm sure you guys have all experienced this, but when you're having those one-on-one conversations or in those meetings where people are speaking up and you see like the language that people are reaching for to describe what's happening inside of them. And it's really fascinating to see which words are closest, and like maybe they're not the most precise, but the ones that come to you kind of instinctively, they are often very romantic in a way that I feel so conflicted about. And I don't know why, because I love romance as a concept. And I sometimes wonder if it's just like years and years of having unfortunately been in the type of workplaces where, the language of family and domesticity and love was taken to be like, and that's why you should be writing all these terrible blog posts all day long. It was taken away and turned into something else. And so now I feel very hesitant to maybe like corrupt it with something that I actually do love and care about very deeply. That's all a long preamble to talking about the aesthetics, which Ari had also brought up when we were sort of planning for this event, if people could think about the aesthetics of their organizing. A lot of my work is in fashion. That's my background, and I'm currently an editor for Essence, which is, I'm biased, but I think the best fashion publication, working today. And that has, I think, made me a lot more open to looking at certain eras with the framework of trends or patterns, in a way that often when we hear the word trend, it has this connotation of being oh, it's going to fade, it's going to pass, it's not real. And of course, that's always the danger, that something is going to be superficial. What I say this all the time, it's basically my motto now, but just because something's superficial doesn't mean it's not deep. Something that comes to the surface is extremely revealing. And the moment that people adopt it or reach for it, or it feels closest, I think speaks to a lot of what's being shared. When I was, like last night sitting up, like trying to answer Ari's question, what's my personal aesthetic for organizing? I have a friend who a while ago said that she thought my organizing ethos was like Cher Horowitz from Clueless, which I do think is true. Like I have a lot of uncertainties about, maybe my skills as an organizer, but my skills as a hostess, unimpeachable, unparalleled. Definitely, yeah. And like Ari writes about this so beautifully, and so does Alyssa, the like emotional labor side of organizing, where yeah, I do feel very confident that when I bring people into a room that they're going to feel heard, they're going to feel taken care of. But I'm really good at ordering exactly the right amount of pizza for a meeting, which is now unfortunately a useless skill in a pandemic. But like the practical and the social elements of making people feel like they're going to be heard, I think that's kind of like the Cher Horowitz aspect of it. But I did think it was so funny that when I was trying to think about what it looks like, I went immediately to what it feels like. I started describing a mood of something that's maybe like a little bit lighter, or not necessarily easier, but something that's, at least in certain respects, it has an element of being enjoyed or being fun. And yeah, so I wonder if it's sort of all, like with anything aesthetic, trying to put a look into language is really just about trying to describe how it feels in the moment that you're really interacting with it. Yeah, does that answer your question? I don't know.
Totally. Yes, absolutely. Just in the sort of in the narratives of like, in the organizing narratives, like the piece I haven't mentioned yet, but which I think is obviously sort of very germane to this conversation, is Nikil's piece for N+1 in issue 26 called Canvassing, which I just remember, receiving in my email and just being ecstatic, just because it was so different from what you'd written before, Nikil, and it was so kind of it was just like, it was so focused on process, as a lot of the work tends to be, but also as the writing tends to be, and I guess you just went through a very grueling and political campaign that you're in the midst of one, and the one that also had to kind of really shapeshift in response to the pandemic, basically, it seems comprehensively and totally. I guess I'm just curious whether whether you sort of like have some distance from it now to be able to kind of reflect on ways in which it wasn't what you expected, and also sort of ways in which like you managed to occasionally find some distance from it in order to not get just like completely lost in process, because that just seems very hard to me.
Thank you. So yes, so I'm very moved by everyone's reflections here, so I'm also trying to see if I can respond to them in some way. So I would say that there's like having gone through a political campaign in which one is actually a candidate is a very interesting experience, in the sense that I think what we've talked about in various ways, each of us so far, is like the immersive part of organizing, and I think this Gornick talks about this well, Ari talks about this well, and Alyssa and Haley in the writing. I think that there are these moments where in organizing where you're suddenly this whole person that is unusual, and like I think that's what happens in the joining of the Communist Party. In most of these anecdotes, there's one that Ari mentions where it's not really the party, but the farm workers movement. But essentially, you're a divided person. It's like the oldest story in the books. You're a subject, there's an object. You live this world of philosophical dualism, and it sucks. And then you join the Communist Party, and then you're whole all of a sudden. And I think that's the moment that's like really extraordinary. And I think that's what happens in these moments of organizing, where you're like, oh, I'm not a divided self. Everything I do is essentially like a part of me, and it's always going to be that way. And then that doesn't, I think we well said, it doesn't last, or you become embarrassed about it, or there's something, but you remember it and that sustains you in some way. So, I mean, it's a thing that we have to be suspicious about. Understandably, I think, just the intensity feeling, because you're like, is it very different from like any intense feeling, like selling real estate? Presumably, like, people also feel that way when they're like, I sold a house and I was like, and it just, I don't know, and it was $1 million or something. I don't know. And so and you have this moment where that everything is true for you and you're a whole person. But I think, I just feel like there's like varieties of it in all kinds of work. But I think we just think that this kind of work is not sociopathic, and that kind of work is. But when you were a candidate, when I was as a candidate, you lose a little bit of that. You lose because you're suddenly like this name and this person, and there's a sign for you, and you like show up places and you're the person. And if you're a movement candidate, as I was, I mean, like you're like, no, I'm actually a vehicle for the movement. And this is what was attractive about Bernie Sanders to a lot of us, was that he represented movements and could be disciplined by them. And so canvassing for Sanders was like offered this opportunity where you didn't have to prepare yourself in various ways for what at least this was true for me, for what it is you're going to say or how you're going to spin the person's policy. You're like, well, this is more or less what I believe. I say it. It's sort of more or less what the candidate believes. And so we can move on to other things. Maybe I'll meet this other person and talk to them on this other level. And then those are the moments where you experience these moments of intensity, where your interests align, you actually are, I mean, frankly, I like doing it because I like meeting people. I like to be able to talk to people and get out of myself and be able to do that. But I lost a little bit of that as a candidate, and then doubly, behind the screen and organizing in this manner. I missed it very deeply. And so on election day, it was returned to me in this way, where suddenly I saw people for the first time in ages. And it was the happiest day of my life. I was just like never, I mean, I had a child, that was nice too, but like this was even better. I thought it was great. And so it was like, I thought it was extraordinary. And so, but you do remain sort of alienated from it to some degree. And so that's just an interesting problem. And you never want to, and probably it's good for political figures to like not feel at home in themselves and like be like, oh no, I'm actually a movement person. How do I keep maintaining that? But yeah, so I was by nature of the work, it's like, it feels distancing. And I think I sort of miss just being able, like I was just at a rally about anti-gun violence. And it's like our states, whatever, new soon-to-be state senators here. And I'm like, no, I would really just like to be like here and not anyway. That feels silly to say, but it's just, I miss that part of organizing.
I want to just go back to Gornick for a second on, I think, hopefully a relevant point, which is, one of the amazing things about reading the book, and Ari and Alyssa, you both talk about this, is, it is just this like collective document, in the way that Nikil is describing, the power of crowds and just being one among many, that the book is just so, even though you're only with a single person at a given time, the experience of it is so overwhelming. You really feel like you're kind of lost in a crowd. And as the people accrete and the stories accrete, the sense of, the sense of possibility until it erodes, the sense of possibility is only increasing. And Ari, I was just curious about, because I don't know that we talked about this that much, but yeah, how did that, what was that sort of, can you think of, analogous reading experiences that were where that sort of collective energy comes through so much? Was that something that felt really like formally exciting about the book, but also kind of like, then maybe, as Nikil says about his own campaign, kind of sadly ironic once the pandemic hit and there was just so little contact with the outside world? And I guess that's sort of the literary sense of crowdedness and of all these sort of voices.
Yeah, I mean, to be totally honest, like I think, I mean, well, I guess we did talk about this in a certain way, which is that I think I would just occasionally say to you, well, like, the thing about the book is that it doesn't totally work. And I don't know if I want to say that in the piece. And I think, like, I sort of like hit that question like every few weeks, like whether that was kind of relevant or not. And I mean, here's what I guess I would say now is that, like, I don't know how many people are familiar with the book, but basically, like, it's a strange book. I think that now it would be called like autoethnography, maybe. But really that is to say it is a like first person account. It is like it's a first person kind of messy, like, maybe like maybe there's some composite characters, like we're not 100% sure, like she says in the situation in the story that like it's fine to make up composite characters and like maybe not mention it, and like, so it's definitely like not it's not a work of social science, but it is ethnographic in the sense that like the vast middle of the book is, as Mark was saying, like a collective document where she is like going around first New York and then the whole US, talking to people and getting their stories and about their lives in the party and in many cases their eventual falling out with the party. And a lot of that material is fairly unprocessed, like as books go. Like there's like really long block quotes, or there's like it doesn't feel entirely worked through. And I'm not actually sure. I mean, it's amazing because a lot of the material that she gets is just amazing. Like people's stories are like, so many people who will, would say, for example, that they either like met their partner or in many cases left their partner because they really got in deep organizing for the party, and that turned out to be like the best thing that ever happened to them. And so like this, yeah, just really intense accounts of how people's personal lives were imprinted by this experience. But I don't know that it feels, I think, turgid a little bit in like a literary way. Like it doesn't move. And all of that middle section is kind of bookended by, I think, like a very, very beautiful, very, very smart, kind of long personal essay at the beginning about Gornick's own childhood in the party, and a lot of her ideas about kind of the party and its legacy, and and how people talk about it, and also about feminism. She herself gets interested in looking back at her childhood in the party when she discovers feminism, when she becomes a feminist as an adult, and sees this, this kind of parallel experience of, like this, she's very interested in revelation always. And so the idea of, this kind of revelatory experience of like seeing the world from a feminist perspective for the first time, right? Like that makes her go back and ask, well, is that how it felt for the communists, like of her parents' generation? the people who kind of like, I mean, this is never quite said, but I think it's implied that like for her generation, like people who are, you know, she's like 18, she's like a student at City College in 1956 when the party kind of falls apart, and like, you know, so her own coming of age is very much about like about moving away from it, but she gets interested in like what does it mean for, you know, the people whose coming of age was about getting sucked into it, and I think there's a disconnect between those pieces, that frontispiece and then the middle of the book, and then the conclusion is weird, and I don't even know if we have time to get into it, but I think that there's a almost like a bit of a mismatch, and I think that actually is because like the elephant in the room is that like she's not really an organizer herself. Like she's very interested in the experience of organizing, but she's not really an organizer. You get the sense from what she says about, and I mean, if I'm biographically like wrong here, if I'm like missing something, like, you know, like please, like I would be very happy to be like corrected. But like the sense that she gives is that, you know, like even like in the women's movement, she doesn't seem to have like a taste for the actual kind of like work of politics. Like she likes it when, and I mean, I don't mean this judgmentally, but it's just like, it comes through. Like she likes the fun parts. And like when people are like bickering or schisming or like, you know, one senses even just like doing like the kind of like more like mundane stuff, she's like interested in that kind of conceptually, but she's like, she doesn't like doing it, or you know, and you get the sense that there's a certain kind of like political evacuation that is involved there, and I think that Nikil was maybe pointing this a little bit, like the difference between, you know, I think that her book sort of forces the question of like, okay, well, like what is the difference between what you're talking about and like the like guy who just like, you know, sold his first subprime mortgage, right? Like, and I think that the question is sort of answered insofar as by the book, insofar as like, you know, I think it's like what Freud would call like an oceanic feeling or something. It's like what a lot of her interview subjects are talking about, and that really is about a kind of opening up into like a collectivity that is much larger than oneself, and having its energy kind of flow through you. And I think that, you know, that does seem sort of analytically different than like what's going on with the subprime mortgage guy. But I also think that the content of like, what are you fighting for, is like not really that important to the book. And sorry, I'm going on, but yeah, I do think that's like a little bit the like mismatch between beginning and middle, is that like she is like so much about form, and then the people that she's talking to are like really talking about content. And like, and you figure that like the people that her interview subjects also may have had like a lot to say about, you know, like the actual like content of what they were fighting for, and like, you know, like questions of like labor and coalition building and like compromise, and, you know, and but it's just not really her interest.
I think this is like a good moment to bring up another line, Alyssa, from your piece that that my colleague Lisa Borst, who organized this event very brilliantly, she flagged, and I also was sort of very, I mean, on brand, very taken with these lines as well, which is toward the very end of the piece, you say, what I really want to read is something that will capture the feeling of being on the left today, our moods, our fears, our backgrounds, our plans, our prospects. I want to read more about what it's like to be in the midst of the struggle from people who are currently struggling, unfiltered through the lens of victory or defeat. In some sense, happily, I think both your piece and Ari's piece, do this work. So that's helpful for us. But I'm really sort of curious. As an editor, I feel like I have a selfish interest in that very question, because these are things that, one wants to publish. But I'm curious, and this is a question really for all of you, if you feel like there's, exemplary work that sort of fits into this, or sort of kinds of genres that are lending themselves to these kinds of particular questions in the present, or is it really just like, is our protest videos and like that genre for our time, and should we, be okay with the fact that like the future Gornick is actually like a videographer, at least at this particular moment. And yeah, I'm really curious if anybody on the panel has thoughts about that. But somebody has to go first.
I can go first, since I guess it was from my piece, so I should probably have some thoughts about it. But I'm not going to answer your question about like what the genre is directly. Maybe it'll come to me in the course of saying some other things. But I do think, this also goes to something that really struck me about your piece, Ari, and how much like the layering of history and feeling of reading romance is so much of like her on the new left, like looking back at the old left and trying to like parse that intergenerational relationship. And so reading it, I think both your piece and mine are sort of looking at, like Gornick's look at the old left from the perspective of like the left today, and trying to think about all of those levels of like history and struggle, and what we take from them and what we can take from them, and what also actually we can't. And I think that was sort of where that line came from. Mark was like ending up with feeling like both, like there is something like, and she's like, Gornick is like, can this be a guide, like in the new intro to the book is like, can this be like a guide to all of these socialists who, she's like, why are there new socialists? I don't get it. Like she's very befuddled. But not completely hostile. She seems like a little bit kind of troubled sometimes by like, Bernie and his fans. And so, but like regardless, like, and so I think it's like, can it be a guide? I don't know if it can be a guide. I think it can be a resource. It can be something that we read and like think about our relationship to, like, what do we share with like the American communists? What do we, and some of the content, I think, as you're saying, Ari, is like very severely missing from her account, although like it comes out in their voices still. Like, I think her framing of it is often like she's imposing a frame. She's like suspicious of both the oceanic feeling and sort of the content. Insofar as I say it's like Marxism, she's like, ugh, like, ideology being imposed or whatever. And it's like, that is true in some instances, and in others it's like something that people really find a useful way of thinking about the world. But like, you have to really get into like the detail of her descriptions of people's stories to sort of see that, which is why I think it's like, I really value those like little oral histories or whatever. And I feel like I would really like to read, in some ways, I think in some ways, like what I'm looking for is basically like that without the frame, without the parts that you are saying, I think rightly, don't work about the book, Ari, like the parts that are like the more like unmediated prompts for people to talk about what their experiences are like and what they've meant to them and where they come from, and like, to try to understand something, which I do think helps you understand something both about like what it's like to do this kind of politics, or that can be a way of recognizing something that does sort of like hold true across like different generations of like political organizers and activists and politically engaged people, but also that can give us like some more traction on like what is different, what's distinctive about our time, like what are the kinds of like problems and like things that people are responding to. And there is a lot of actually like really interesting biographical detail about like, she talks like where the communists come from, like what those sort of specific, their like family backgrounds are, like what happens, like they lose their job, they're like, you know, working on a ship and they talk to some guy on the ship who's like a Marxist or a communist or whatever, you know, like they work with the fruit pickers, they work in like so many different ways. And like, I think it's just, what are those things today? Like what is bringing people into politics today, into like radical politics, into left politics? And like, you know, as we're saying, I think one of the things that is really valuable about, as we're like before, that it's hard often to write about organizing while you're in the midst of it, both because of time and also because like it's really hard to write about a campaign you're in the middle of, because you're not, I don't know, you're not gonna like air dirty laundry or talk about what's not working or what's like going badly or whatever when you're in the middle of it, because you're like, no, I'm only gonna, like in the middle of a campaign, I only want to write like propaganda, you know? And so like I feel like it has to, it's hard to get that kind of like, you know, perspective that that might be a more like accounting with all of the kinds of ups and downs and difficulties in the midst of things. But I also really do want to read more of that, or to have somebody collect stories or something, you know, because the other thing is like I do think it's a useful like service and a way to go out and talk to all of these people and collect those stories. And so I don't know, and maybe they are, there obviously could be other genres, maybe like tweets or like TikToks. I don't know, I'm very like a TikTok idiot, but Haley, it sounds like you are more adept there, so you can collect like some TikTok videos. But so some of it might be like curation also, like other places where people are putting these kinds of stories and content out. But that's what I think I'm most like, yeah, really want to just like get a sense of in real time also, and not like, you know, much, you know, because like again, like, and Ari and I have talked about this a bit, but like the distance between obviously like Gornick and like her looking back at her parents' generation is something like you can't write like a contemporary romance American communism that is contemporary to its moment. So like what would a version of it be that is contemporary to like the stories it's telling? Oops.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious if others have thoughts on that before we move on, and eventually to questions as well in the audience.
Well, I was thinking too, as Alyssa, you were speaking, I was thinking about what Ari said about how if the writing process had even gone on one more week, the whole essay would have changed. And that is something I have thought about myself as well. Like, yeah, like I'll admit it, I have thought about writing about organizing, and I've just decided to hold off because it never seems like the right time, or like I know what to say. And, you know, to again go back to that language of romance, like there's a reason that all of our great love stories tend to focus on either everything right at the beginning or everything right at the end, because it's so much easier to say, I know, right? Like I know that this is either full of promise and we'll leave it here, or I know exactly where this is going to end up. And again, like when I say easy, I mean simple, like I mean direct, and I mean that there is a sort of perceived clarity of thought that comes from having experienced rather than experiencing. And that's what I meant to earlier when I was saying that I thought Alyssa's essay about organizing at Yale was so generous, because those reports from the moment they're happening is what turns into eventually somebody looking back and being like, oh, that's what it felt like then, right? But it has to be so many essays. It has to be so many different types of words. Yes, I can send everybody a lot of TikToks, but all the teens that are really into communism right now, I would love to do that. And that too, like I'm joking, but I'm serious. It is sort of, okay, this is like a more complicated thought, but in terms again of the romance and of knowing that so much of the literature that we go to is, you know, if we're going to use this language, I'm just going to use it. Like it's written by somebody with a broken heart, because the longer you do this, the more likely it's not just that you rack up the small victories and the big losses, but like it doesn't stop hurting any less. And that really colors the experience of writing it. And I've often found that like the people who can like look right at that own hurt feeling, even if they're not able to do it without bitterness or cynicism, but are just able to experience it in their writing, that requires so much humility, you know? And like now that I've gotten to know people who've been doing this for way longer and are way smarter than I am about organizing, like, yeah, when I think about how they constantly have to commit to teaching another generation of people to experience the exact same feeling in mediums or methods that they don't even know exist yet, I feel like that is the type of change to the writing that we can't like predict or control for. But I want to like fight against the idea that the best type of work would hold it still. You know, it would be the type that would say, if I let it go for even one more minute, everything about this would change. Or if I had started even 1 second earlier, I would have thought something so different. Because yeah, I just feel like that opens up so much more of what's possible. Does that make any sense? I don't know. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Can I just a quick, this is almost like another question, but it was sort of just aroused by what you, or elicited by what you were saying, Haley, where, it's just like a lot of these are essays about losing in some way. And so like, I mean, Alyssa's to some degree and Ari's to some degree, like that I mean, at least Ari's in the case of a national campaign, there is like a rent strike. I mean, that does, but like, and there is this kind of, I don't know if there's any room to talk about this at some point. There is this kind of redemption of New York architecture. Like there's a lot about architecture in Ari's essay, and which is just the best. Anyway, I just feel like it's worth observing how the buildings function in the piece at some point. But I don't know. It's just like we do in the same way that Alyssa, you were saying, we can't. It's difficult to write about something in the middle of a campaign because there's some sense of betrayal that actually the confidence is held tightly. And so, and you can only, you know, and I almost want, and so you can write an op-ed, the most degraded form, but you can't, you know, and in fact, I remember just asking when I was an editor to like ask GSO organizers to be like, write about your campaign, and then it would be like, well, we have to check with the comrades, and like then we have to, you know, and of course, right, it's like you have to do that, and then you write a report, but it has to be like, it's in, you know, you wonder how much is being withheld, understandably. And so then, I mean, I don't know, are there pieces where it's just like, and then we won, and so, and then and yet it's true, and you learn so much from it. I just don't feel like I can't think of one. There must, I don't know, maybe there is one, but maybe that's a genre.
You gotta write it. Go for it.
Isn't it great? No, I don't know. It's just like you don't sort of, I like, it doesn't really feel like it does feel like you have to, you're then able to, I mean, because the other thing I would say, and I wonder if, I guess I do and I don't feel, and this is not meant obviously as a criticism, it's just like I do and I don't feel that like the essays, I mean, Alyssa's essay on organizing and Ari's essay on Gornick are necessarily like capturing what it feels like now exactly. Like I do feel like there is this necessary distance that is achieved, and I do feel like there is, I mean, Haley mentioned this, that there is a retrospective element in certain, that always has to happen, but also there is this, I don't know, I just feel like, and this goes back to the fantasy of the whole self to me, is like I do feel like you just, it's the nature of writing, like of certain kinds of writing, that you do prize this you always have to see double. Like James Merrill has this line, Lord knows I've tried to keep from seeing double. And so there's just this like, you need to have an ironizing distance. You do always keep two sets of books. There is this like other part of you that's like, well, I always have this thing, this hinterland that I retreat to. And then that's where I write about it. But I don't know, maybe that's all. Anyway, I guess that's sort of the problem I think about writing about organizing. I mean, I feel like I've restated a lot what people have said.
No, that's it's very welcome. I think we've got a couple questions in the Q&A, and I encourage, we still have some time for that, so I encourage everyone to ask questions, but I'll start with one here that is, well, this really actually for anyone. The question is, Gornick and her subjects often reference in the book that the communists genuinely felt they had a shot at winning, that they were attached to an international struggle that they could win in their lifetime. do you feel like the absence of the oceanic feeling in, say, American socialist organizing is born of a certain fatalism? Because there is no major workers' state, or because of the horizon of climate change, or whatever else. I'll give you like 3 more seconds to think.
But if we win a Green New Deal, or it's going to be really great, guys. I just feel like, no, I don't, that's not very useful. I don't know. So I'm going to look at this question again. Is it like that, that it's, can you ask the question again? Now,
yeah, of course. Sorry. The Gornick and her subjects often referenced the communists genuinely felt they had a shot at winning, that they were attached to an international struggle they could win in their lifetime. Do you feel like the absence of the oceanic feeling in, say, American socialist organizing is born of a certain fatalism? That there aren't, there's not this like worker state to look to, and there are, there is a pandemic, there is the specter of climate change, and that like fundamentally sort of, that it may not be possible to kind of like generate that kind of feeling because of these just markedly different conditions.
Yeah, I guess I would feel, and sorry, since I've just started speaking, but I almost feel like it's not true. Like there is like a pretty strong optimism. I think, I think that, and part of it is, I think the reason that romance is attractive and is that, and this is maybe what Gornick is suspicious of, is like, or I think she's avowedly suspicious of, is that like, there is this kind of groupuscule, like, it was quite large, the American Communist Party, but relatively small by the standards of other communist parties. And so, but it is this kind of like feeling that people have with, not just with the Soviet Union, but basically within this country that is deeply hostile to the movement. And so you feel like you're creating something new in a place where it just seems like impossible. And so I do feel like we have this feeling that like we're doing this thing that no one, we thought it for a long time, that we were going to do this thing that no one thought was possible here, and now more and more people think it. It's still not that many people, but it's more. And so we're doing, and it's new, and we're creating this new society, and there's going to be a Green New Deal, and our society is going to be better. We'll have transit, our buses are going to be electrified. I don't know. There is this moment of just like, feeling where I feel like we do, maybe I just take the characterization to me personally feels like we do have like actually a strain of pretty serious optimism. And so I think that's why the book is both, because we're also embattled in this basic, obvious way, and yet feel great. I don't know. There's like this, sometimes you win a few things, then you're like, great. I don't know, like we can do it. I think that there's a little bit of that right now anyway.
Yeah, I would say I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, but I also, like Nikil, somewhat disagree with the premise, in that I do think, that feeling like, exists today when it exists. But I think like more broadly, I'm not sure that the oceanic or whatever kind of like affect, and I think really, what could be described as like 20th century modernist progress narratives, like actually have all that much to do with each other than the fact that they overlapped. And I think to the extent that they did overlap, that was sometimes like electrifying and really amazing for people, and also could be incredibly dehumanizing. And, and I think, you know what I mean? Like ego death is great, but like ego death, like also the socialist anti-communists, like, were not entirely wrong to also be concerned, even though they were total pricks about it, about like the way that like that like Stalinism prevented people from thinking straight. I mean, I think really what they were talking about was like mid-century mass society that was like happening, you know, in like both the East and the West, and like it's not anything specific to like, you know, what was sometimes called totalitarianism, but like but point being, like, I don't know that like for like there's like lots of like good debates we can have about like whether we want a party now or not, but I don't think that it makes sense to like conflate that with the affective question.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar in that, like, I think that also the sort of scale doesn't necessarily have to do with, I mean, I don't know if it's like the oceanic feeling per se, but like that kind of feeling of what Gornick describes a lot as like a feeling of like wholeness, or like the being like swept up in the movement and really believing that things are possible and that you will win and all of that, like, which I like, you know, in our union campaign, like believed very fully, like, and it was not a like internationally connected thing. I mean, we were an international union, so like we were part of an international union, so it was in that sense, but it wasn't like, it didn't have to be like, this is like the worldwide communist movement, to have that feeling of like, what I'm doing here is really important, it's part of this bigger thing, it's part of like something that then I like, you know, that at the time I was like, well, this actually is a way to like start fighting climate change and like all of these things. Like I had this narrative of what I was doing was really important to like, you know, that I was like building like the low carbon labor movement, which was going to fight climate change and like fight capitalism and sort of be our way forward in the future. And I still like, actually, I don't think that was like wrong. It was like obviously one very small part of it that was not in itself was not going to like end capitalism and like save the world from climate change. But it was like one thing that I felt like, this is one very small piece of a very big puzzle, and I can see this as a thing that like I need to be doing. And it didn't have to be, so it didn't have to be like part of like there didn't have to be like a worker state or like the, you know, CP, like the Communist Party as an international force. I do think those things like change the conditions of possibility, and like, or like there are significant differences in terms of like what the actual field of politics are, and like what politics would look like, and like what a like left-wing or socialist politics would look like in the contemporary moment. But I don't know if that has, as Ari's saying, much to do with like the affective dimension of like how you situate sort of like your own project in relation to like a broader whole, how you feel yourself to be part of like a collective or a whole that is like beyond yourself. And I think you can get that from a lot of different kinds of political projects. The other thing I'm sort of about Nikil saying is that I do think that the thing that I miss about organizing now that I'm not doing very much of it anymore is the way that it actually, I think, generates optimism, and I think a very necessary and important way, because like whenever it's like when you're doing things, you can see how things actually are possible in some way. You realize that like, you know, you are constantly trying to move people and like bring people around and like win these like small victories and sometimes like larger victories. And I think doing that just like, it is a very like I don't know, the like conditions of optimism and pessimism are not just like some like intellectual state where you look at things and you assess them. Like there is something about the activity of doing that work that I think makes you like have to think about, how could this be possible? What would I need to do to make that possible? Like, how am I going to go do those things that make that thing possible, and like help you see paths that where you did not, just from like sitting at your desk or whatever. And sometimes those paths like are dead ends or whatever. But I really think that the, you know, as Nikil's saying, the kind of the optimism of the like American socialists, in part because people are like out trying to do a lot of things and like are then generating the actual changes and conditions that make optimism, you know, like you are changing the actual conditions of possibility and then like feeling a different way about what's possible in the future. And that might be a different set of like what you believe is possible than like you think that revolution is going to happen in 10 years, is like a lot of the communists that Gornick is talking to did. Although like I would have said that before, but now I'm like, I don't know, maybe revolution is around the corner, like whatever. I am like not going to actually put a timetable on revolution at this point, other than like, I hope it comes soon. So, but I think it's, so you can have different like relationships, like the temporality of what you think, what success is and all those things. But I think you really have to be like doing it to see how things might be possible.
There's a relevant question for Haley, and relevant because Haley, you spend a lot of time organizing writers who typically, as a category of people, are not known for their optimism. And I'm curious about what you think. Sort of, how could you categorize the relationship between organizing and writing?
Oh boy. Well, Nikil was getting at this earlier, and this is something I do think about a lot, which is that, like, this is just for me personally, but yeah, like the work of organizing is in many ways so opposed to what it means to write, right? Because writing is traditionally something that is quite solitary. Most of the time, Dornet is an exception to this, but like most of the time you're not working with a co-author, and the relationships that you have with collaborators is very much behind the scenes. It's you and your editor, it's an editorial board. And then the work of organizing, of course, has to be so collective and is about so much more than just one person or one leader. And so I think there are a lot of things that are shared between the two. But yeah, often there is this conflict. What I will say about this question specifically, and like I'm less familiar with the literal concept of an oceanic feeling, but something that I've heard from other people who've been doing this more, or who maybe are academics in the history of labor, is that like when they come and they talk to our members who are freelance digital media workers of many different mediums, not just writers or editors, but are also artists, and they produce videos and podcasts. But we had one person in particular who came as a facilitator, and they were like, oh, it's kind of funny, you guys are so ready to accept like these big philosophical concepts, and you're so quick to adapt the language. And of course, like the inverse of that is like, but then you have to go apply it, right? Like that's one way that maybe people who work in an editorial field are very fast to pick up on this all-encompassing feeling that at its best and at its most romantic, writing can feel like, where it's like you just have to get something out. And that doesn't have to be something that's exactly positive. It doesn't have to be something that you do it because you love it, but because you're feeling it so intensely, you have something to say. And so like in that respect, I think I see it in our organizing, and we're very lucky to have that, I guess, like that fluidity. And because again, so many people have backgrounds in reporting or journalism, I feel like I say all the time, like when you're at the bargaining table, like that's your time to interview management, like put those skills to work there. And in the same way with like the one-on-ones, or when you're facilitating a meeting. I feel like hopefully I'm not getting too far away from your question, but yeah, Ari, like you were saying before about like Gornet being someone who loves writing about organizers and really kind of like wants to hear their stories and to share their stories. But yeah, I don't know if she did that much of the work. And even, when I read her essays on feminism, it does seem like she considered herself to be there primarily as a journalist. And I think that's something that I personally have been very lucky to see in the last, I guess, like 5 or 6 years in media, as more and more publications have unionized, where it's like, it's not just enough to be the reporter. It's not just enough to cover it and get it out there in a newspaper or magazine. At a certain point, you've got to, I don't know, carry your weight.
If Mark, is it okay if I jump in? Okay. So, this is really the one thing that I specifically wanted to say this evening is about the relationship between writing and organizing. And it's also what I was trying to trick everybody into addressing in some way when I was asking before, when we were doing our pre-planning about, like, can you describe your relationship to organizing in aesthetic terms? Which is that I think that like my big revelation about my personal relationship to organizing in the past few months, or like even more specifically, like the relationship between like my like personality and organizing, is very similar to a thing that I have had to learn over and over again as a writer, which is that like sometimes things that, this is so obviously just like a confession that I'm dying to give. Sometimes things that you think are like pathological about yourself are actually just actually just like symptoms of ways that you are blocked and actually like need to like find you know, the like outlet or like expression that can kind of like properly, you know, channel and contain them. And I think very specifically, for me, the common thread there is that over and over again. So actually, I would, just to back up, like I think this is something that like Alyssa, you definitely talk about in spade work, like the sense of, you know, kind of being somebody who like believed in organizing and maybe even, you know, had a lot of kind of theoretical interest in it, and, you know, maybe like, you know, a kind of sidelines relationship to it for a long time before you like really jumped in. And like that, you know, that was definitely my experience as well. I think I had been very adjacent for a long time, but felt like, you know, my personality was kind of not quite right for it for whatever reasons. And then realized like, oh, I mean, there's all kinds of reasons that like, sure, like I like don't think it's right. Like I think that all the time. The main thing I've been doing is like organizing my building, but also some workplace stuff and, you know, and other things. And I think the common thread though, where I keep having to remind myself like no, you're not a bad person, you just like need to find the outlet, is like whenever I have this feeling of like I love to manipulate people and yet I am not evil. Like that has like I would like literally obsess about that for years and then just be like, you just want to create characters. Like you're just talking about writing. Like it's like, and like we can, I think there's like, again, like a very interesting conversation about like, what does it mean to like want to turn people into characters, or like to want to represent to your life in narrative terms. And there's like violence there, right? And like people have thought about that like very sharply. And there's like also potentially violence in organizing, right? But like neither of these pursuits, I would argue, is like inherently bad. And I think that is like, that's like been very exciting for me at moments in the past few months of being like, oh, like that's like where, you know, your like oceanic self and your like egoistic self can kind of like merge in ways that I hope, if you like also are like keeping your head enough above water enough to like not become like a like megalomaniac, you can be like, oh right, like both of these things can exist at once. Like I like, it's like okay to like have the desire to like I love having like a spreadsheet of everybody in my building. It's like the bet, like and feels super literary to me. Like it's very like Henry James' House of Fiction. Like I want to know like you know like, I want to know where everybody is, and I like want to know what all of their deals are. And I think that like for, and I want to be able to like slightly like push them around, but like not because I'm like trying to hurt them, but like because I'm like interested in them and also like, you know, like love, you know, my fellow man or whatever, you know, and so I think like that's, you know, but also I want to have a sense of humor about like, I don't know, like maybe I like am a sociopath, and like, so I just think that trying to like be in that ambivalence is like that's like also like why I'm like never to get past, like I'm like never gonna be able to run for office. I mean, I would never like want to run for office, but like I don't think like I will personally ever be able to like get past that point of like insane like neurotic spiraling that is like involved to just be like, okay, like now what we're doing is trying to win, and like we're not also doing a sideline in like this other thing in the present tense, like as everybody's saying, right? Like I think that like for me is like probably a little bit of like a limit to like certain kinds of political work, but yeah, I think that's like the that is also, I think, a real confluence that, despite the fact that I think Gornick is impatient with certain aspects of, or seems to see a kind of misfit for herself between her, you know, kind of ornery personality and the work of organizing. I think that that connection between organizing and writing is actually one that she's like very interested in.
Funny, because I was also thinking of when your question, Ari, about the aesthetics of organizing, my answer was going to be like a spreadsheet underneath like a fluorescent lit, like, I don't know, like a fluorescent lit, like, I don't know, basement somewhere. But I feel like the thing about the like spreadsheet or something that's really interesting, I don't know, I feel like things like that are like, there's like such a getting between, and maybe this is where also Gornick goes wrong in some sense, because like she's like missing some of the ways that like this like very bureaucratic or kind of like quantitative or like, you know, like making lists gonna win, like how are you gonna get to this like goal oriented activity is connected to also the very like, you know, emotional aspects, because like the list isn't just like a bunch of people, it's like people in your building, they're people you know, the people you have to talk to, like the list is terrifying. You're like, oh my god, like the number, like you get like number, you like set goals of like people you're going to turn out to something, and it's like not just a number, like people will be like, oh, I'm just like a number like that you have to get, and you're like, oh my god, no, the numbers are so terrifying, because it's like all these people who are like committed to like bringing to this thing, and like that is like I have to go and talk to these people, and like that is like very, you know, all of these things that I think are supposed to be these like clinical, like detached, like bureaucratic ways of treating people are actually like so imbued with like the actual like relationships and emotions and whatever of organizing. And where I think like the rubber hits the road in a lot of ways of like going from that, like the feelings and like the like relationships you built to like, okay, like, well, what do we translate those into? Like, are those people going to show up to the thing or like win or whatever? And although I am sympathetic to your suggestion that you are not suited for organizing, Ari, I will say I've heard that one a lot. So I think everyone is like not suited to organize until they like get organized in the right context and by the right person or like in the right fight or whatever. So that's not to like scold you. I'm just saying like, because I feel like it's like a thing that no one feels like they're suited to it in a way, because it is like a weird, it's not like a natural form of social life, or there are parts of it that are like, and I think you write about some of this already, like where like, you know, I really, you know, there's that part where you write about like chatting with your neighbors or checking in on people, and that's like about like these relationships of like care, and like Haley, I think some of what you're saying about like being like the share of like organizing, and you have like the like making sure that like the things that are like we already do know how to do, like talking to people emotionally, or like making sure that like the event is planned, or like that people are showing up to it, whatever, that we may know already, but then it like merges with this other kind of thing we don't know how to do. And it's like, how do you have that kind of thing that you do know how to do, like the emotional labor or the planning, or the care, or like the things that are about relationship building, and then like use it for something. And how do you do that in a way that doesn't feel like violent and instrumental? And sometimes it does, and it's like really hard to like, I think, merge those kinds of those two kinds of relationships, which are like, you know, like political and personal relationships, and that like always coexist in organizing, I think, and it's not like, they're like inseparable, and it's so hard.
Well, and I think, I think I was gonna say this before and then I like lost my own thread, but like a thing that I think is so helpful in spade work is when you talk about like the like getting to that point of being like, oh no, like it, you know, it's not that I have the wrong personality for this, and that's not even the right question to ask. Like the question is like, how do you like become a person who does it? And the answer is by doing it. And like, and that, but the specifics of what you talk about in that piece of like, feeling like one hurdle was about getting over some very like gendered forms of the kind of like demand to be likable, I thought was like very relatable and like and really like complex and interesting, because obviously there's a tension there between like, it is like those same kind of feminized forms of, you know, emotional intelligence or whatever that like in some very real ways are like exactly the kind of skills that you need, but then there's a way that they can also, if you like don't know how to, you know, turn it off or whatever, like, or if it becomes about needing to please people or smooth over contradictions when you're supposed to be exacerbating contradictions, like you stop, you know, you like hit walls, and like trying to like get through those walls is super interesting, and I think feels like a very like feminist process actually, like also in a way I think, you know, Gornick seems interested in.
Totally.
We unfortunately are going to have to wrap up pretty soon, but there's one question here that I'd like to kind of just that I'd like to ask Nikil, but I will editorialize a little bit, just so as not to sort of repeat some of what we talked about. But I ask it because, you know, Nikil, in addition to your political work and you write about many topics, including basketball, which I kind of hoped would come up tonight, but maybe we can have another Zoom event for that. You know, you also write about urban history and architecture and urban planning, and the question, and of course you picked up on you know, some of the parts that I like so much about Ari's piece as well, which are the you know, New York parts and the, you know, the physical space of buildings, and Gornick's book is so rich with this too. And the question is, could these characters exist today? My city is organized into segregated neighborhoods. Corporate grocery stores have taken over. I see Gornick's characters as inseparable from the community dynamics of those places. If they were alive today, how would you react to their shock at the everyday differences that would impede their kind of organizing today? And my editorializing is just to say that I don't think you would say that any differences would impede the organizing. So I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the spatial experience of organizing and of campaign work, and of the way that that's felt to you, you know, either in these campaigns or in the past.
It's a great question. So yeah, I mean, I'll speak to my own experience, but it's actually a very good question, because it's like, I mean, it does sort of, it's got to be, you sort of feel like, your instinct is like, no, anyone can organize it, and you're just sort of like, but actually we also know that we also maintain that geography is important, and urban spaces do, and urban, rural, metropolitan divides exist. I don't know, there's just ways in which the question has to be true as well, even though your instinct is also to be like, you can organize in any kind of setting. But I mean, that was that was one of the attractions I had to organizing to begin with, is that it opened up parts of the city. It gave me a pretext, I would say. It gave me personally a pretext to open up parts of the city that I wouldn't otherwise have a reason to go to, except as a kind of tourist or voyeur or something. Like I can bike to parts of the city, I can take I can just like show up places. But I have no reason to talk to anyone. I have no reason to engage anyone. And then, but if you were organizing in some way, then you have a reason to do it. It is then still a pretext, and so you're engaging people in a kind of, in a way that can be transformative, but is not. You're not like, oh, I'm part of this neighborhood, or I have friends, or it doesn't actually necessarily work out that way. It's just you have a base, let's say, like I think of people in a certain area. But it does open them up. And I mean, I remember after my first few bouts of like canvassing, I think for the Sanders campaign in 2016, it was like suddenly all these doors and houses were meaningful to me in various ways, and I would recognize, I knew where, you also have glimpses into people's lives because you're opening doors, and you're like, why are they dying and eating at 4 p.m.? And like there's just things that are like and like everyone has dogs. It's terrible. Like the dogs are always the pretext for not opening the door. But the other thing that it's in the campaign setting, which this has become more salient, is just like the sheer like thickness of associational life. I think I never actually have read these sociological works that talk about how American associations, people are declining in their associational life, bowling alone, etc. So I can't, but I think that's what they talk about. But it just feels actually in a campaign setting that actually people are just implicated in so many different associations because they all have events every night. You're like, I have to go to the bocce club. Like, why? Really? Like that's in like, no, the bocce club in South Philadelphia is really where the power exists. And like, and it's just, that's just turns out to be part of the campaign experience is you're like, and like how you go to like when you show up and who you show up with. And so that I don't know, that's sort of like become interesting is I just feel like that seems to be more true. This is like I don't know if I haven't really thought this through, but I sort of feel like it's more true in working class neighborhoods. It's not like, I feel like if you're in a transient downtown neighborhood, I don't know, in a way the Chamber of Commerce is the association that's like more interesting or more powerful, or the building association or whatever, just these kind of like larger, but I state that very like cautiously because I'm not sure if that's really true. But yeah, I don't know, that's like another kind of urban experience, but at the same time that it leaves so many people out and sort of like, you're just like, I always feel like I wanted to, you want to do this because you want to engage people, you want to get out of yourself in some basic way because you're sick of yourself. I'm sick of myself. I like want to like go and talk to people, and then in the conversation you're like, oh no, I'm not one, like this person is very interesting and I'm not as boring as I thought I was. Like there's something within me that is connecting to this person. It's separated by space and time and generation and race, or but actually it turns out we have interests in common. Like we may not share even beliefs, but we have interests. We have like, and that's like what solidarity is. It's not like you have all the same things, you have the same experiences, etc. In a way, political figures will often say sort of speciously, it's like we need political figures who have gone through the things, like who have had trouble like paying rent and whatever. And that's not wrong exactly, but you could be that person and still be a person who's like who could ends up a neoliberal and whatever. Like it doesn't guarantee you anything, but it guarantees you something, but not everything. And so I don't know. That's sort of the urban experience to me. Is it's just opened up parts of the city, but it's still but not quite enough. Like I'm like there's still more here. There's still more I need to know, and that's sort of the fun part of it. I feel like I miss it now. I miss it a lot.
Well, I think that that note of urban exploration is a nice note. It's a nice one to end on as we sit here staring at our Zoom screens. I just want to thank all of these amazing people so much. Haley Mlotek, Ari Brostoff, Alyssa Battistoni, Nikil Saval. I want to thank Lisa Borst at N+1 who set up the event and organized all of us into it. And yeah, please consider subscribing to N+1 so that we can publish more amazing pieces like the ones you've heard about tonight, and so that we can pay evil conglomerates exorbitant fees in order to make event programming possible like this. But one day we will stop paying them and we'll have real life events again, and that'll be really nice. Thank you so much for coming, and have a great evening.
Thank you.